All right, number 63 is called the Arena Chapel, and it's also known as the Scroveni Chapel. And we need to know the name of one of the paintings inside called Lamentation. This is in Padua, Italy. The artist is Giotto or Giotto. You can say either one. He has a last name, but we just need to know him by Giotto. And the chapel, the dates for the chapel, it's 1303 and it's brick. And then the fresco is 1305. Remember, fresco is the style or the type of painting where you're, it means fresh. So you're painting into the wet plaster as the plaster is drying. The painting is fusing into the wall. So the College Board gives us 3 images. We have the exterior of the chapel, the interior of the chapel, and then we have the Lamentation painting. Another term to know is called Trecento. So you can refer to this time period as Trecento, which is the 1300s, or if you're referring to the 1300s in a century, that would be the 14th century Italian art. So you can refer to this as 1300s, 14th century, or 1303, or Trecento. Any of those terms would work. Okay, some context about the time period. So this is considered both late Gothic or early Renaissance. Giotto is going to be our bridge to kind of bring us into the next movements. Just like Doryphorus, Polyclitus's Doryphorus was really important for how it changed art history. The way Giotto paints influences so many artists at this time period that he is going to help bring in the Renaissance. Oops. It's just beeping at me right now. Hang on a second. What is happening? Okay. All right, so at this time period, remember the church controlled everything up to this point. The church was the #1 patron of the arts. So here we start to see a shift, and then we're going to continue to see this in the Renaissance. The Renaissance is really famous to have the really wealthy Florentine families, like the Medici family. The Medici family is going to be the patron of most of those early Renaissance artworks. So we start to see that shift happening here from, instead of the church commissioning and being the patron of the arts, we see wealthy families. So this one is, we need to know that a family is the ones that paid for this church to be created for a very specific reason. We'll talk about what that is. Okay, some more context. So here's a photograph or a depiction, I guess, of what it would have looked like. So here's the Arena Chapel, and then here's like a front porch, looks like a loggia out in front that's no longer there. All right, so this was built next to an ancient Roman arena, which is why it has that name, the Arena Chapel. And then it is, why do I keep hitting that button? It's called the Scroveni Chapel because of the patron, Enrico Scroveni. So he at the time is Padua's wealthiest man, just like the Medici family is going to be the wealthiest family and the most powerful family in Florence. The Scroveni family is the wealthiest in Padua. And this is because of his father, who was a banker, otherwise known as a money lender. He would lend money to people and then charge interest, which is bad. So that person, his father, would have been condemned to hell based on the writing of Dante, called Dante's Inferno. So in this poem, Dante's Inferno, he describes the landscape of hell and what it looks like and what people would have, been looking like when they're being tortured in hell based on the sins that they committed in life, just like being a moneylender. So his father committed the sin of usury. Usury means being a banker, lending money at high interest, at high rates of interest. So that relates to the function, right? His son needs to atone for his father's sins. So the chapel was commissioned by his son, Enrico Scroveni, to atone for the family's sins so they can gain salvation. That's the ultimate goal. All right, so Khan Academy has 3 videos just on the Arena Chapel and the paintings of Giotto. So this is a photograph or a screenshot from there. So this is when they're talking about how the sin of usury and then Scroveni is painted in the Last Judgment, charging interest equals going to hell. All right, so this is the painting Lamentation. All of the paintings, all of the fresco inside is done by Giotto, but College Board wants us to focus on this one. And then surrounding his paintings, he has these borders, and then he has these quatrefoil shapes inside that also help depict stories. So what is this quatrefoil depicting? This is on the, whoops, this is on the left, like right next to the Lamentation. So can you see what's happening in there? It's kind of a cool little picture. All right, so this is an example of prefiguration, which we talked about with the Catacomb of Priscilla in early Christian art. So it's using a story from the Old Testament. So what's happening is Jonah is being swallowed by the whale, and he sits in that whale for about 3 days, and then he emerges from the whale. So this is a story being used to parallel the idea of Jesus being resurrected 3 days later. Right? So here he is dead and everybody's really sad and they're mourning him. So it's kind of like a sign of hope. Like, don't be so sad because we know what's going to happen later in having faith in that he is being resurrected. So the idea of using those Old Testament stories to parallel to the New Testament stories is prefiguration. It's like foretelling what's going to happen. All right, again, another screenshot from the Khan Academy videos. So there's three levels of paintings, and it starts on the right. You have Joachim and Anna. That's the story of Mary's grandparents being told on the top right, and then the bottom right is the life of Christ. It's like the middle, and then the bottom is the Passion of Christ, and then you can also write those on the left. So what I did on my note page is I actually wrote that on top of the photograph. And then content, that's what's being depicted. And then we are now going to focus on the Lamentation, which is hanging on the left. And there's a better photo of that one specific painting. All right, so we're going to start by comparing this to the Pieta. What can you tell is similar? And then what is different between these two common depictions of Jesus and Mary? So the Pieta we talked about means pity or compassion, and this represents Mary sorrowfully contemplating the dead body of her son, which she is holding in her lap, and it's always just the two of them. The Lamentation is going to have a group of people. So Christ is dead, and his mourners, which is going to be Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene. She's at his feet down here. She's always included. They all gather around him in extreme sorrow. So it's still depicting the same feelings. It just has more people. All right, so we need to talk about why Giotto is so amazing. So what is he doing to direct our eye? What is the focus of this artwork? Where is our eye being led to? And how is he doing that? So he has this really strong diagonal line, right? He has that cliff. So go ahead and draw right on top of your artwork, if you can, those leading lines leading you straight to Mary and Jesus. Mary even is continuing that line, right? Her shoulder line, her eye line, pointing straight at her son's face. Then you also have these two figures who are in the foreground of this really shallow space, and their backs are to you. So they're kind of like bookends. They frame Mary and Jesus. They stop your eye from wandering around. And then you have all these angels, like beams of light, whoop, coming out of their eyes. So you have that gaze. He's using, and you can say the same for everybody else around, right? The eye contact, the gaze of the eyes is leading your eye, the viewer's eye, straight to the focal point. So even though these diagonal lines are not actually painted or drawn in the composition, they're implied by that gaze. All right, so this is everything that I just said, but we're going to write this in a little bit. All right, now compare this to traditional compositions. So in the Virgin between two saints, you know, it's very symmetrical. Jesus is in the center. It also forms a cross, as opposed to Giotto, who is using the rule of thirds composition. This is not symmetrical. This would be considered asymmetrical. So this is like revolutionary, something that has never been seen before. It's not that big of a deal to us, but it was back then. Also, he's using some symbolism to emphasize the sadness of the scene by having that bare tree, which we know, again, we know it's going to grow leaves. We know that tree is going to resurrect. So he's connecting that to the sadness and the death at the time, which will grow again later. And then the grieving angels. All right, what we're going to write down are the innovations. So everything we just said about breaking traditions, I have written out here. So this is what we need to have in our notes. So he's depicting an overall range of emotions. It's not just Mary and Jesus, you know, being in anguish and tormented. There's, you know, the calm. These guys are pretty calm over here. And then you have sorrow. And then you have, you know, what this guy's showing you up here. All right, we're gonna talk about some of these terms, but let's write them. So modeling is having an obvious light source indicating a direction of light. It's what we would refer to as shading. So art historians call this modeling. And you can see, I mean, he's still outlining, you know, using contoured lines, but we're seeing shading, which we're gonna call modeling. The shading and foreshortening is mastered, creating solid 3D forms, which is a form of chiaroscuro, which is an Italian term, which means using modeling, shading, creating these 3D volumes of mass. He's using a different compositional arrangement. We talked about it being asymmetrical, using the rule of thirds, with an obvious foreground, midground, and background. Really shallow space, like think about a really shallow stage, like you don't have a lot of room to move back. And then we're seeing figures from the back and multiple points of view, right? We're really far away now from the Egyptian twisted perspective where they can't really turn their shoulders. They're stuck, but their face is profile. Now we're seeing all different angles of people's faces. We're able to turn our faces. It's amazing. Here's an example of what I mean by foreshortening. Like if you're drawing someone's hand coming straight out at you, that is really hard to do. So here we have these angels being foreshortened where their heads are coming straight out to the viewer. All right, we're going to watch just a couple snippets of these Khan Academy videos. This is going to help explain chiaroscuro and modeling better than I am able to explain it.
Warmth of the figures around them who watch, and something that we see throughout the cycle, figures who have mass and volume to their bodies, who exist three-dimensionally in space. Gone are the elongated, swaying, ethereal bodies of the Gothic period, and Giotto gives us figures that are bulky and monumental, where drapery pulls around their bodies, and taken together with the emotion in their faces, it's almost like we have real human beings in art for the first time in more than 1,000 years.
Giotto, we think, was Cimabue's student and learned from that great master who had begun to experiment with the chiaroscuro that you're speaking of, this light and shadow, this ability to model volume and form and mass, but nothing like what Giotto has achieved here. And you're right, it is the coming together of both the chiaroscuro as well as the emotion, as well as the human interaction that creates the sense of the importance of our existence here on Earth.
And I would also add the clarity.
All right, back to the Arena Chapel. So the architecture of this building is really simple, right? What type of ceiling is this? Where have we seen this type of ceiling before? So this is a barrel vaulted, this picture on the left, this is a barrel vaulted ceiling, which we first saw with the Colosseum. So it's a Roman invention, right, that we saw again being used throughout Romanesque. And then what he's doing is he's painting the fresco on the ceiling. He's using the same blue, even though it looks different on the right. He's using the same blue on the ceiling that he uses throughout the entire chapel, which really unifies the whole chapel together. And he's painting almost like a sky, you know, blue, and then it has stars, and it has medallions with Mary and Jesus and the apostles and the saints, and all those fabulous people. And then in the back, we've got 3 lancet windows. So at this point, we should be able to just identify elements of architecture and be able to say where we've seen them before, right? We talked about lancet windows with the Gothic Chartres Cathedral. And then there's 3 windows. So we should be able to talk about symbolism with what we're seeing. All right, the back of the chapel, right back here, depicts Judgment Day, which we've seen before, first in Egypt with Hunefer's, the Last Judgment of Hunefer. And then we talked about Judgment Day with our Romanesque tympanum, which, you know, is bisected in the middle. You have heaven on the left, and you have hell on the right. And then our version of hell is based on Dante's Inferno. All right, so here's some close-ups of his Last Judgment in the back of the chapel. So on the bottom, you have Enrico Scroveni. Remember, that's the patron, the one paying for this, the one commissioning it. And he is handing a model of the chapel to Mary, saying, here it is. We did this. Please forgive. Whoops. All right, and then to the left of Jesus and to the right of Jesus, you're going to have 6 dudes over here, 6 dudes over there. So that's going to equal 12. And whenever you have 12 people surrounding Jesus, that represents the 12 apostles, which we're going to see when we talk about the Last Supper. Okay, we're going to pause again, watch another little snippet of a Khan Academy video. All right, so we're going to watch Steve and Beth talk about the depictions of hell because it really reinforces how the paintings here relate to the function of the chapel.
The scene of hell on the lower right with a large blue figure that is meant to represent Satan. Surrounding him are souls being tortured in hell.
A lot of this imagery is inspired, I think, indirectly by the work of Dante, who had not so long ago written the Divine Comedy, which was extremely popular, and he describes the landscape of hell.
And he equates the punishments of hell with the different kinds of sins that people committed. And so in the Last Judgment that we're looking at, and because the patron here was concerned with the sin of usury, we see usurers featured, and they're being hung with the bags of money on the ropes that they're hanging from.
Right, usury is requiring interest for when you lend money. It's basically just the act of banking, and that was a mortal sin. In fact, Dante speaks at great length about the usurers who have their money bags hanging from their necks and are in one of the lowest of the circles of hell. Below the usurers, you can actually make out a specific individual also hanged. This is Judas, the disciple that betrays Christ.
So anyone leaving the chapel from this exit would look up at the scene of Last Judgment, up at the cross carried by 2 angels. Perhaps they would notice that figure that I just noticed, of a figure behind the cross, sort of grasping it for dear life, and would also have looked up and have seen Enrico Scroveni himself, the patron, offering this chapel to the 3 Marys.
As the public would have walked outside after a sermon, after Mass perhaps, they would be reminded right before they walk back into the world of desire, the world of sin, that the sacrifice that Christ had made, that story that had unfolded in this chapel, comes down to decisions that they need to make in their own life. This is, in a sense, a kind of last reminder before you walk out to take these stories seriously.
And Giotto makes it very easy for us to do that by painting these figures in their humanity, by making the narrative.
Okay, this image here that they just showed, or they ended on there, is a picture of Mary's parents. So these would be the grandparents of Jesus. And this is showing you the first kiss that is represented in art history, Mary's parents, Anna and Joachim. Fun little snippet of information there. You don't need to write that. All right, previous art history questions. So Giotto di Bondon's Lamentation, which we just need to know him by Giotto, but that's his last name. Giotto di Bondon's Lamentation demonstrates a shift from Gothic painting traditions in its A, plastic modeling of form, B, choice of subject matter. We've seen this repeated over and over and over again, so definitely not B. C, elongation of figures, or D, use of gold leaf background. So there wasn't any, I mean, there is gold, I guess, in the halos that looked very Byzantine. I don't think gold leaf was used. The figures are not elongated. They're pretty realistic. So then the answer is going to be modeling a form. I don't know why the word plastic is used there. I don't know. So it demonstrates a shift from Gothic painting traditions and its heightened attention to naturalism, spatial dimensions, and the physical mass of the figures depicted in this work. And then there's been a couple essay questions. You're going to have 6 essay questions when you take your test. And in the past, Giotto's artwork has been used twice. One of them was an attribution question where it showed you this painting of Mary, of Jesus's grandparents, but assuming that you didn't know this painting, how would you be able to attribute it to the work of Giotto? What characteristics are you seeing here that you wrote about when we talked about his breaking traditions? What is he doing? So you could talk about the modeling, you could talk about the compositional arrangement. The focus is not in the center. They look naturalistic, all those things. And then there was another essay question one year about the quatrefoil, about this little painting of Jonah and the whale on the left. So this was the question: what is the scene happening in the margin on the left? How does this marginal scene represent a parallel to the main scene? Where have we seen this before? Right, so we saw this in the Catacomb of Priscilla. And then using specific examples, analyze the innovation in Giotto's technique that makes his style revolutionary. So questions 1 and 2 here are very specific. You'd have to know what that is a picture of, and then how that relates to what's happening in the Lamentation. All right, just summarized 3 Khan Academy videos in one. Done.